The year was 1894. The Great White Howl, they called it. A winter so profoundly violent, so absolute in its freezing terror, that the history books of the Northern Territories would remember it simply as the year the sky fell and shattered the earth. Down in the sheltered valley of Oakhaven, where the wind was supposedly broken by the ancient pines, the grand estates of the elite were dying. Inside the sprawling, multi-story Victorian mansion of Mr. Sterling, a man who had built an empire clear-cutting the surrounding forests and cornering the regional coal market, chaos reigned. The pendulum of nature had swung with terrifying force. It was 30 degrees below zero. Sterling's imported cast-iron steam boiler, a hulking mechanical beast that had cost an unfathomable $450,000, was groaning. It consumed exorbitant amounts of imported anthracite coal, yet the heat evaporated the moment it touched the towering single-pane glass windows. The iron pipes, frozen stiff by the sheer thermal vacuum of the blizzard outside, gave one final, metallic shriek before bursting. Freezing black water spewed across polished mahogany floors, instantly turning to ice. Panic echoed through the freezing halls. Yet, if you were to brave the blinding white fury of the storm and climb the exposed, merciless ridge overlooking the valley, the place where the wind did not just blow, but screamed like a wounded leviathan, you would find a different reality entirely. Inside a battered wooden shack that looked as though it could blow away at any second, a 16-year-old girl named Odelia walked across the floor. She was barefoot. Outside, the temperature was a deadly 30 below. Inside, the air was wrapped in a heavy, golden, impenetrable warmth. The temperature held perfectly steady at a balmy 75 degrees. There was no roaring fire consuming cords of expensive wood. There was no hissing iron radiator. There was only a profound, heavy silence, the soft, rhythmic breathing of her bedridden mother, Maura, and the peaceful, deeply undisturbed sleep of her two little brothers, 8-year-old Tobin and 6-year-old Silas. Odelia stepped onto the clay floor, feeling the radiant, ancient heat rising through the soles of her feet. She looked down at the ground, tracing the invisible line of the mechanism buried beneath the earth, a mechanism the arrogant men of the valley had laughed at, a mechanism they had mocked, pointing their gloved fingers and calling it a filthy, primitive sewer. But the earth does not care for the mockery of men. The laws of thermodynamics do not bend to the weight of a gold coin, and soon, the very men who had banished her family to this freezing ridge would be crawling up the icy slope, begging to buy the warmth she had pulled from the dirt for exactly $0.00. But to understand the profound justice of this winter, we must turn the clock back 6 months to the dying days of autumn, when arrogance still wore a smile and the cold was just a distant rumor. Before we walk down the bitter path of exile and witness the birth of a forgotten engineering marvel, I ask you, traveler of the digital age, to pause. If you value the ancient wisdom that respects nature rather than trying to dominate it, if you believe that true wealth is measured not by bank accounts but by the warmth we provide for our families, then leave your mark here. Subscribe to the channel. Like this video to help spread the embers of this forgotten knowledge. Share this story with those who understand that the old ways still hold power. And tell me in the comments below. From what city are you watching? And how do you fight the cold when the world turns freezing? Let us build our own community of warmth. The autumn leaves were still clinging to the branches when the decree came down. Odelia's father, a humble carpenter who had spent his life repairing the grand homes of Oakhaven's elite, had passed away suddenly from a lung fever. He left behind a griefful widow, 3 children, and a debt of exactly $32 to the local bank. a bank entirely controlled by Magistrate Croft and his primary investor, Mr. Sterling. $32. To Sterling, it was the price of a fine dinner in the city. To Odelia's family, it was an insurmountable mountain. There was no grace period. There was no compassion. Arrogance cannot thrive where empathy exists. It requires the subjugation of the vulnerable to feel tall. Magistrate Croft, a man whose academic degrees hung heavily on his walls and whose heart had long since turned to ledger paper, arrived at their modest home in the town center with the sheriff. "The law is the law, young lady," Croft had said, his voice dripping with that unbearable, condescending pity, the powerful reserve for the powerless. "Economics dictates that assets must be liquidated to cover liabilities. We have a shack up on the North Ridge. It's town property. We will allow you to relocate there. Consider it a mercy." The North Ridge. It was the highest, most exposed elevation in the county. The soil was rocky, the wind was constant, and the shack was a dilapidated husk previously used by transient loggers. It was a death sentence disguised as charity. Odelia did not weep in front of them. She loaded their meager belongings onto a borrowed handcart. She helped her mother, coughing and frail, into the center of the cart, wrapping her in every blanket they owned. Then, holding 6-year-old Silas by the hand, and with 8-year-old Tobin pushing from behind, the 16-year-old girl began the long, humiliating walk out of the valley. The townspeople watched from their windows. Some felt pity, but none intervened. Fear of Sterling's economic retaliation kept their doors locked and their mouths shut. When they arrived at the shack, the reality of their exile hit with the force of a physical blow. The walls were made of rough-hewn planks that had shrunk over the years, leaving gaps wide enough to slide a hand through. The wind whistled through the interior, carrying the bitter promise of the impending winter. There was a rusted, cracked cast-iron stove in the corner, but the chimney pipe was rusted through, and it would consume wood faster than 3 lumberjacks could chop it, sending 90% of the heat straight up into the freezing sky. That night, as the temperature plummeted, Odelia wrapped her brothers tightly and sat awake, watching the frost form on the inside of the single window pane. She listened to her mother's strained breathing. The fear was a living thing in the room. If she relied on conventional heating, they would freeze. She had no money to buy seasoned, dry firewood. She had no money to buy coal. She had no money to repair the roof. She looked at her raw, blistered hands. She had no money, but she had the earth. And she had the memories of her grandfather, a man who had lived among the native tribes of the far north, and who understood that to fight the winter, you do not stand tall and challenge the wind. You sink low and embrace the thermal mass of the ground. The next morning, while the children searched for scraps of dead branches, Odelia found a rusted pickaxe and a heavy iron shovel left behind in the weeds. She walked to the center of the shack's dirt floor and brought the pickaxe down. She began to dig. She did not dig a hole. She dug a trench. Starting from the firebox of the ruined stove, she carved a channel into the earth, 2 feet deep and a foot wide, running horizontally straight across the entire length of the small cabin's floor, winding like a serpent before finally connecting to the base of the chimney on the far wall. It was agonizing labor. The ground was hard, packed by years of neglect and the creeping autumn frost. Her hands bled. Her back screamed in protest. But every time she paused, she looked over at the meager pile of blankets where her mother lay, and she brought the steel down again. By the 3rd day, the floor of the shack looked like a battlefield. A massive, muddy trench bisected their living space. It was on this day that the sound of horses approached. Magistrate Croft and Mr. Sterling had ridden up to the ridge, ostensibly to survey property lines for a new logging road, but truly to inspect the misery of the exiles. It is a dark truth of the human condition that those who hoard wealth often seek out the destitute to remind themselves of their own perceived superiority. They pushed open the door without knocking. Croft covered his nose with a silk handkerchief. Sterling looked down at the massive ditch running through the center of the room and burst into a booming, mocking laughter. "Good heavens, Croft! Look at this!" Sterling bellowed, his heavy wool coat making him look like a well-fed bear. "The girl has lost her mind to the altitude. She's digging a grave inside the house." Croft stepped gingerly over the dirt pile, his polished boots gleaming in the dim light. He peered into the trench with profound disdain. "Fascinating. A regression to the primitive state. Tell me, girl, what is this? An indoor sewer? Are you planning to run the mountain runoff through your living quarters?" Odelia leaned on her shovel, her chest heaving, her face smeared with dirt and sweat. She looked at the two men, their arrogance practically suffocating the room. "It is a draft trench," Odelia said, her voice quiet but remarkably steady. "For the fire." Sterling laughed harder. "A draft trench. The girl thinks she's an engineer. Listen to me, you ignorant child. Heat rises. That is the basic law of physics. You burn coal in a vertical chamber, you boil water, you push steam. My new boiler in the valley cost $450. It exerts 200 pounds of pressure. That is how you defeat winter. You don't dig a muddy sewer and expect the fire to crawl along the ground like a rat." Croft shook his head, offering his academic sneer. "It's a tragic lack of education, Sterling. She doesn't understand thermodynamics. Earth is a thermal sink. It is freezing cold. If you run heat into the freezing ground, the ground will absorb it instantly and extinguish your fire. You will freeze in a week. It's a mathematical certainty. You are building a frozen tomb for your family." "You should fill this sewer back in," Sterling sneered, tossing a single copper penny onto the dirt floor. "Buy yourself a rag to plug the holes in your walls. When the first snow hits, the sheriff will come to collect the bodies. Try not to make a mess of the property." They turned and left, their laughter trailing behind them like a foul odor, drifting down the mountain toward their warm, expensive, fragile mansions. Odelia did not pick up the penny. She looked at it lying in the dirt. Then she picked up her shovel. Let them laugh. They understood the physics of iron and money, but they knew absolutely nothing of the ancient, patient physics of stone, clay, and time. What Odelia was building was not a sewer. It was a low-tech engineering marvel derived from the ancient Roman hippocausts and indigenous smoke trench designs. It was a horizontal thermal battery. To understand her genius, we must look at the fatal flaw of the modern, expensive heating systems of the elite. When Mr. Sterling burned a fire in his massive cast-iron stove, the flames reached 2,000 degrees. But because heat rises, the vast majority of those incredibly hot exhaust gases rushed straight up the vertical chimney and out into the freezing sky. He was literally paying to heat the clouds. To compensate, his stove had to burn enormous amounts of fuel constantly, requiring endless money and labor. Furthermore, as soon as the fire went out, the thin iron cooled in minutes, and the house instantly plunged into freezing temperatures. Iron transfers heat rapidly, but it cannot store it. Odelia's design turned this logic upside down. Once the trench was fully dug, she took her brothers to the icy riverbed a mile away. Over a dozen grueling trips, they hauled back hundreds of dense, rounded river stones. These were not just rocks. In the language of physics, they were high-density thermal mass. She meticulously lined the bottom and the sides of the sewer with these stones. Then she went to the riverbank and dug up heavy, wet clay. She mixed the clay with dry pine needles and sand, creating a primitive, highly resilient mortar. She coated the stones with this clay, sealing the trench entirely. Finally, she laid wide, flat stones over the top of the trench, making it level with the floor, and sealed the cracks with more clay. The mechanism was simple, yet profoundly elegant. At the start of the trench, she built a small, highly insulated firebox out of brick and clay. When she lit a small fire in this box, the heat did not go straight up. Instead, the vertical chimney at the far end of the room acted as a vacuum. The draft pulled the roaring flames and the scalding exhaust gases sideways. The fire was literally sucked horizontally through the buried stone trench beneath the floor before the smoke finally exited the chimney. Croft, the arrogant magistrate, was partially right. The earth is a thermal sink. It absorbs heat, but that was exactly Odelia's plan. As the 2,000-degree exhaust gases traveled through the 20-foot trench, the dense river stones and the heavy clay absorbed the heat. The exhaust entering the chimney at the far end was reduced to a mere 100 degrees, meaning she had successfully trapped 90% of the fire's energy inside the floor of her home. The massive weight of the stone and clay floor became a thermal battery. It took hours for the floor to warm up, but once it did, it held that heat with terrifying efficiency. Even if the fire went out completely, the thousands of pounds of hot stone radiating beneath their feet would continue to heat the cabin for 24 to 36 hours. It was a slow, gentle, omnipresent, radiant warmth. But Odelia's genius did not stop at the thermal floor. She had solved the problem of heating, but she still faced the problem of fuel. Without money, she could not buy the dry, seasoned firewood that takes a year to cure. The only wood available to her was the freezing, dead green wood she and the boys dragged from the snow-covered forest edges. Burning wet wood is a thermodynamic tragedy. Half the weight of green wood is water. When you place wet wood in a normal fire, 50% of the fire's energy is entirely wasted just boiling the water inside the log. It creates a cold, smoking, hissing fire that clogs chimneys with deadly creosote and provides almost no heat. For the rich, wet wood was garbage. But Odelia had built a kiln. Because the flat stones covering her buried trench were constantly radiating an intense, dry heat of about 140 degrees, she simply stacked her freezing, wet, scavenged logs directly on top of the sewer line across the floor. The results were miraculous. The relentless, dry, radiant heat from the floor baked the wood from below. The moisture inside the logs evaporated rapidly into the cabin air, which also solved the problem of winter air being uncomfortably dry for her mother's lungs. Within 48 hours, wood that was completely soaked and frozen solid was reduced to a 0% moisture content. It was bone dry, lighter than paper, and structurally cracked. When she fed this perfectly kiln-dried wood into her small firebox, it combusted with a frightening, explosive efficiency. Because there was absolutely no water left to boil off, 100% of the wood's stored solar energy was instantly converted into pure heat. She was extracting 3 times the thermal energy from the worst garbage wood in the forest than Mr. Sterling was getting from his premium oak. Her cost of operation, $0. Her fuel, free, wet scraps. Her thermal battery, the earth itself. By late November, as the first major snows began to fall, the North Ridge shack was transformed. The wind battered the thin wooden walls, but inside, it was a sanctuary. The heavy clay floor radiated a constant, soothing heat. Little Silas and Tobin played barefoot on the flat stones over the trench. Mora's cough eased. her chest warmed by the humidified 75-degree air. They were surviving. But survival was only the beginning. Nature was about to balance the scales, and the arrogant men of Oakhaven were about to learn that money cannot bribe a blizzard. The sky turned a bruised, sickening shade of purple. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast that the dogs in the valley began to howl in terror. The great white howl was descending, and it was bringing a cold that breaks steel. The great white howl did not merely arrive, it detonated. On the 14th of December, the barometric pressure in the Oakhaven Valley collapsed with such violence that the glass in the town's street lamps shattered inward. The sky, stripped of all light, turned a suffocating, bruised purple. And then, the wind descended from the northern peaks. It was not a wind of air, but a wind of solid ice, carrying jagged, microscopic crystals of frozen moisture that sandblasted the bark off the pine trees. The temperature plummeted from a manageable 20 degrees to an apocalyptic 40 below zero in the span of 3 hours. Down in the sheltered valley, the illusion of human supremacy evaporated instantly. Inside Mr. Sterling's grand 3-story Victorian estate, the pendulum of panic was swinging wildly. The sheer thermodynamic violence of the blizzard was actively draining the heat from the structure. His 450 Dazuerzoiton cast iron steam boiler, the mechanical pride of his existence, was screaming. The Iron Beast was designed for normal winters, not a glacial anomaly. As the temperature inside the walls dropped, the water inside the elaborate network of iron pipes began to slow, then slush, and finally, inevitably, expand. Crack, hiss, boom. The sound of the elite's infrastructure dying echoed through the mahogany halls. A pipe burst in the drawing room, spraying black, freezing water across silk curtains. Another ruptured in the master bedroom. Sterling, wrapped in 3 layers of imported wool, stood in his flooded foyer, watching his breath form clouds of white vapor. His expensive anthracite coal supply, delayed by the blocked rail lines, had run out at midnight. Desperate, Sterling ordered his shivering servants to burn the reserve cordwood in the grand fireplaces. But the wood was winter-cut, green, frozen, and completely saturated with moisture. It was a thermodynamic failure of catastrophic proportions. When the servants threw the frozen wet logs onto the dying embers, the fire did not roar. It choked. 50% of the remaining thermal energy in the hearth was instantly cannibalized, wasted entirely on boiling the frozen water trapped inside the wood fibers. A foul, thick, acidic white smoke billowed into the room, stinging their eyes and coating the expensive wallpaper in sticky creosote while providing absolutely zero radiant heat. The temperature in the mansion crossed the freezing mark. The water in the crystal pitchers turned to solid blocks of ice. The rich were freezing in the dark, suffocating on the smoke of their own wet wood, completely paralyzed by the failure of their expensive machines. But high above them, on the exposed, merciless, wind-battered ridge, there was silence. There was profound, unshakable peace. Inside the fragile wooden shack, the brutal 40 below zero wind screamed against the thin plank walls, desperate to get in, but it was defeated by the sheer, overwhelming mass of the earth. Odelia sat in a rocking chair, humming a soft, ancient melody. She wore only a simple linen dress. The air inside the cabin was a perfectly stable, humidified 75 degrees. Beneath her bare feet, the sewer, the primitive dirt trench lined with river stones and packed clay, was performing a symphony of physics. The thermal battery was fully charged. Over the past 3 weeks, the constant horizontal pull of the exhaust gases had baked thousands of pounds of stone and earth until they were saturated with stored solar energy. The entire floor of the shack was acting as a massive, slow-release radiator. It did not matter that the wind was ripping at the roof. The heat was coming from below, rising gently, wrapping the room in an impenetrable golden cocoon. On top of the flat stones covering the trench, her scavenged, freezing, wet wood was lined up like soldiers in a kiln. The intense 140-degree radiant heat rising from the stones was aggressively baking the moisture out of the greenwood. The air smelled of warm pine and dry earth. When Odelia opened the small brick firebox to add fuel, she did not throw in smoking, hissing, wet logs. She tossed in wood that had been reduced to an absolute 0% moisture content. The perfectly dry wood caught instantly, combusting with a fierce, clean, blue-white flame. 100% of the wood's energy was converted to pure heat, pulled horizontally through the subfloor tunnel, entirely bypassing the freezing sky. Her siblings, Tobin and Silas, were asleep on a thin blanket spread directly over the warm stones, their chests rising and falling in deep, undisturbed slumber. Their mother, Maura, was breathing easily, her lungs expanding in the warm, perfectly conditioned air. While the millionaires in the valley shivered in their coats, watching their 450 Tigerslow boilers crack and die, a 16-year-old exiled girl was keeping her family alive with a 0 points Oreo ditch of mud and rocks. By the third day of the Great White Howl, the situation in the valley had shifted from panic to sheer survival. Magistrate Croft, the arrogant academic who had mocked Odelia's lack of education, was sitting in his frozen library, weeping silently as he burned his leather-bound encyclopedias one by one in his fireplace, desperate for 5 minutes of warmth. But paper burns fast, and the cold was eternal. Mr. Sterling had lost feeling in his toes. His servants had fled. The walls of his mansion were coated in a half-inch layer of white frost. He knew, with the terrifying clarity of a man staring at his own mortality, that if he stayed in the valley for one more night, he would freeze to death in his own bed. He needed help. He needed a miracle. Wrapped in furs, his face wrapped in scarves, Sterling stumbled out into the blinding white storm, accompanied by a desperate, shivering Magistrate Croft. They could not go south. The roads were buried under 10 feet of snowdrifts. There was only one place to go, up. "The ridge!" Sterling screamed over the roaring wind, his voice cracking. "The logger's shack. It's town property. If the girl is dead, we can use the timber of the walls for firewood. We can burn the shack from the inside." It was a climb born of absolute desperation. The two men, accustomed to horse-drawn carriages and velvet cushions, were reduced to crawling on their hands and knees up the icy slope. The wind tore at their expensive coats. Frostbite gnawed at their exposed skin. They were no longer titans of industry. They were fragile, failing biological organisms at the mercy of a physics they did not understand. When they finally reached the peak, the shack was barely visible, buried under a massive snowdrift. Only the rusted iron chimney pipe, completely devoid of smoke, poked through the white. "No smoke," Croft gasped, falling into the snow. "The fire is out. They are dead, Sterling. It's over." Sterling ignored him. He threw his frozen weight against the wooden door, desperate to find shelter, desperate to find anything he could burn. The door gave way, and the two men collapsed across the threshold, falling onto the floor. They braced themselves for the sight of frozen corpses. They braced themselves for the bitter chill of the tomb. Instead, a blast of heavy tropical air hit them in the face. It was so hot, so overwhelmingly, impossibly warm, that the frost on their eyelashes instantly melted into water. Sterling gasped, tearing the scarf from his face. The air smelled of sweet, baking pine. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, confusion, and profound terror. There were no corpses. Little Silas was sitting on the floor, barefoot, carving a wooden toy. Mora was sitting up in bed, knitting, and Odelia was standing by the small brick firebox, holding a piece of perfectly dry, cracked wood. The firebox was tiny. There was barely a flame visible, yet the room was radiating heat like the surface of the sun. Sterling scrambled backward, his gloved hands touching the floor. The dirt floor was hot. It was burning hot. He looked at the flat stones running across the center of the room, the very trench he had called a sewer. It was radiating a massive, invisible wave of thermal energy. On top of the stones sat piles of wood, baking, drying, transforming into pure fuel. "How?" Magistrate Croft whispered, crawling into the room, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as his frozen body registered the heat. "The chimney. There is no smoke outside. The boiler. My house is a block of ice. How?" Odelia looked down at the two men, the men who had evicted her, the men who had thrown a penny at her feet, the men who believed that the world belonged only to those who could buy it. She did not gloat. The guardian of knowledge does not need to raise her voice when the truth is screaming. "The earth absorbs heat, Magistrate Croft," Odelia said softly, echoing his own mocking words from months ago. "You were right, but you forgot that what the earth absorbs, it eventually releases. I did not fight the winter. I fed the fire to the ground, and the ground is feeding it back to us." Sterling, his lips blue, began to weep. The coal baron, the master of the valley, was crying on the mud floor of an exiled girl's shack. He reached into his heavy coat with trembling hands and pulled out a thick wad of wet, useless cash. "Please," Sterling sobbed. "I have money. I have hundreds of dollars. I will buy your firewood. The green wood in my house won't burn. It just smokes. Please, sell me your wood. Sell me this heat." This is the moment where the wheel of the world turns. This is the moment of poetic justice. Odelia could have turned them away. She could have let them freeze as they had almost let her family freeze. But true strength is not found in vengeance. It is found in the calm, unyielding dominion of one's own worth. "Your money is no good to me if the valley is frozen, Mr. Sterling," Odelia said, her voice echoing with the solemn weight of the ancestors. "But I will not let you die. I will sell you my wood." Sterling let out a pathetic gasp of relief. "But," Odelia continued, her eyes locking onto his, "my wood is not regular wood. It has been cured by the earth. It is devoid of moisture. It is pure thermal energy. It will burn in your frozen fireplaces when nothing else will. And because it is the only dry wood within 50 miles, she paused, letting the silence of the warm room sink into their terrified bones. "The price is $3 a log." Croft gasped. $3 a log? That is extortion. That is the price of a ton of coal." "Then go burn your coal, magistrate," Odelia said calmly, turning her back to him. But they had no coal. They had nothing. The arrogance of the academic and the arrogance of the billionaire had been utterly defeated by a girl with a rusty shovel and a deep understanding of nature. Sterling paid. He paid for every single piece of perfectly kiln-dried wood Odelia allowed him to carry down the mountain. And he did not just buy wood that day. When the blizzard finally broke 2 weeks later, the power dynamic of Oakhaven had been permanently altered. The elite of the valley realized that their imported iron machinery was a fragile illusion. They realized that true survival could not be ordered from a catalog. Odelia, the 16-year-old exiled girl, became the most powerful economic force in the region. She did not just sell them dry wood to survive the rest of the winter. She sold them her engineering. By the following summer, the grandest mansions in Oakhaven were undergoing a humiliating yet necessary transformation. At Odelia's strict, highly paid direction, Mr. Sterling and his wealthy peers were forced to rip up their pristine, imported mahogany floors. Underneath their luxurious living rooms, laborers were digging deep, winding trenches. They were hauling river stones. They were packing clay. They were digging sewers. The men who had laughed at her primitive dirt ditch were now paying her exorbitant sums to build those exact same ditches in their own homes, desperate to capture the ancient, passive geothermal heat that had saved their lives. Odelia bought back her father's house in the center of town. She paid off the $32 debt with a single contemptuous toss of coins onto Magistrate Croft's desk. She secured a warm, prosperous future for her mother and her brothers, not by begging the system for mercy, but by outsmarting it entirely. The legacy she left behind was not written in ledgers or stock prices. It was written in the very foundations of the town. She taught them that money is a fiction that disappears the moment the temperature drops. The only truth in this world is the earth beneath our feet, the fire we carefully tend, and the ancient wisdom we refuse to let die. When you mock the primitive, you mock the very foundation of your own survival. Arrogance builds a house of glass. Humility builds a fortress of stone. And so, my friends, we reach the end of the trail. The fire is burning low, but the heat remains trapped in the stones of our shared understanding. If this story stirred something deep within your bones, if you believe that true wealth is the knowledge to keep your family warm when the world turns cold, then stand with us. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to feed the algorithm's fire. Share this video with someone who needs to remember the power of the old ways. And before you go, tell me in the comments below. From what city are you watching? And what primitive wisdom has your family passed down to survive the modern storms? We are the guardians of knowledge, and our fire will never go out.